October 14th, 1943. 291 bombers climbed into freezing European skies. Inside those aircraft, nearly 3,000 men breathed oxygen through masks already crusting with ice. They were headed back to Schweinfurt, back to the place that had killed 36 crews just 2 months earlier. The men knew what was waiting. They'd attended the memorial services. They'd seen the empty bunks. They'd heard the stories from survivors, stories about German fighters lining up in the distance like cars at a toll booth, waiting their turn to kill Americans. But here's what they didn't know yet, what nobody knew. The greatest threat that day wouldn't come from Messerschmitts or flak batteries. It would come from something far more insidious, something that moved through their aircraft, invisible and patient, something that was already inside with them as they climbed through 20,000 feet. The cold. At 25,000 feet, the temperature outside those bombers dropped to 50 degrees below zero. The aluminum fuselage conducted that cold directly into the crew compartments like a massive refrigerator wall. Frost formed on the inside of windows. Breath froze mid-exhalation. Touch bare metal with your skin and the flesh would stick, frozen solid before you could pull away. The waist gunners had it worst. They stood at open windows, open because the original design provided no covering, manning 50 caliber machine guns that required them to lean directly into a 200-mile-per-hour slipstream of Arctic air. Wind chill at those speeds dropped the effective temperature to levels that would freeze exposed flesh in under 60 seconds. Every man wore an electrically heated flight suit, the so-called Blue Bunny Darty, a one-piece coverall with heating wires sewn throughout the fabric, plugged into the aircraft's electrical system. When it worked, a man could survive. When it worked. But the suits had a fatal flaw. A design error so catastrophic that it's almost impossible to believe it made it past testing. The heating wires were connected in series, like old Christmas lights. If one wire broke anywhere in the circuit, the entire system died. Instantly. Completely. With no warning. And the wires broke constantly. A gunner would twist to track an attacking fighter. The fabric would shift. A wire would snap. One moment, he was warm. The next moment, he was exposed to killing cold with hours of flying still ahead and no way to fix the problem. 15 minutes. That's how long he had before frostbite began destroying his hands. On that October morning, as those bombers pushed deeper into German airspace, dozens of heating suits failed. Men went from protected to exposed in seconds. They kept fighting because that's what you do when focke-wulfs are shooting at your friends. They kept their hands on the gun triggers, even as the numbness crept up their arms like rising water. Steady, inexorable. The mission would become known as Black Thursday. 60 bombers shot down. More than 600 men killed, wounded, or captured. One of the darkest days in American military aviation history. But here's the statistic that should haunt us. In the 14 months ending in December 1943, cold injuries removed 1,634 men from flying duty. During that same period, enemy action removed 1,270 men. The cold was killing more American airmen than the Luftwaffe. This is the story of how that happened, and how one man refused to accept it. The problem began years earlier, in sunny California, where Boeing engineers designed the B-17 Flying Fortress. They envisioned a weapon that would fly higher than enemy fighters could effectively reach. Above 30,000 feet, anti-aircraft guns lost accuracy. Fighter engines struggled for oxygen. The high-altitude doctrine made perfect tactical sense. The engineers calculated the bomber's performance at altitude. They ran the numbers on range and payload and defensive armament. What they never fully considered was what altitude would do to the men inside. They'd never experienced it themselves. never felt what 50 below zero does to human flesh, never understood that no amount of insulation can protect against wind moving at 200 miles per hour. The crews would learn through their own frozen fingers. The B-17 carried 10 men, distributed throughout an unheated, unpressurized fuselage. The pilot and co-pilot had it relatively easy. Their position offered some protection. The bombardier and navigator sat in the nose compartment, surrounded by plexiglass that provided spectacular visibility and almost no insulation. But the waist gunners stood at those open windows, exposed to the full fury of the slipstream. And the ball turret gunner had it worst of all. The Sperry ball turret was a marvel of compact engineering that became a nightmare of exposure. A spherical compartment roughly 4 feet in diameter, just large enough to contain a man in fetal position, along with 2 50 caliber guns, ammunition feeds, and the mechanical systems that allowed the turret to rotate in any direction. There was no room for a parachute inside. No room for extra clothing. Barely room for the gunner himself. Only the smallest crew members were assigned to this position. Men under 5'6", under 150 pounds. They would curl up inside that frozen sphere, surrounded by plexiglass and aluminum that offered no protection whatsoever. Cold radiated through every surface. If his heating suit failed, the ball turret gunner had no options. He couldn't easily leave. The turret had to be rotated to a specific position for exit, and that required electrical power. If battle damage cut the power, if the mechanism jammed, he was trapped. And if his suit failed while trapped, he would freeze. Most chose to stay anyway. They understood that leaving would endanger the crew. German fighters had learned to attack from below. It was the vulnerable angle. The ball turret gunner was often the only defense against those attacks. So they stayed. They kept their hands on the controls, tracking the sky for enemy fighters even as the cold crept through their bodies. The numbness spreading from fingers to hands to forearms, rising like flood water. They kept watching for fighters. They kept doing their jobs until the aircraft landed and someone came to help them out. Flight surgeons sometimes had to cut the gloves off with surgical scissors. Frozen fingers couldn't flex to remove them. The flesh underneath was white, hard, frozen, solid. Many lost fingers. Some lost entire hands. All of them had done their duty until the very end. The first frostbite cases came back from early missions over occupied France. Waist gunners with blackened fingers. Tail gunners whose ears had turned white and numb. Ball turret operators who couldn't feel their feet when they climbed out after landing. Men who hadn't been touched by enemy fire, but were just as badly injured as if they had been. Colonel Malcolm Gross studied the casualty reports with growing alarm. The pattern was unmistakable. Men were getting frostbite despite wearing the protective gear the Army had issued. They were following procedures, using equipment correctly, and they were still freezing. Grow wasn't some desk officer theorizing about combat from a safe distance. He'd seen what war does to men. In 1915, he'd volunteered to serve with the Russian army on the Eastern Front. For 2 years, he operated on wounded soldiers while German artillery exploded around his field hospital. The Russians gave him the Order of St. George for gallantry under fire, one of their highest decorations for a foreign officer. He understood combat. He understood improvisation under pressure. And he understood that when good men keep dying from the same cause, someone needs to fix the underlying problem. The heating suits were supposed to be that fix. The F-1 Blue Bunny suit had been tested and approved. Manufacturers claimed it would protect against high-altitude cold. Procurement officers had purchased thousands. But specifications meant nothing when wires kept breaking. Manufacturer claims meant nothing when men kept losing fingers. Grow documented everything. He compiled statistics that told a story the Army Air Force leadership didn't want to hear. Three-quarters of all frostbite casualties were caused by heating suit failures. Men were being permanently disabled by their own equipment. The training pipeline couldn't keep pace with losses. Every veteran gunner who lost fingers to the cold was a gap in capability that took months to fill. And the enemy causing most of the damage wasn't flying fighter aircraft or manning flak batteries. The enemy was temperature, failed equipment, inadequate preparation. Groh pushed for solutions. He requested engineering support. He asked for authority to develop alternatives. He needed manufacturing capacity to produce improved equipment. The bureaucracy moved slowly. Requisitions sat on desks. Approval chains stretched across the Atlantic to Washington. Officers who'd never flown a combat mission debated the necessity of expenditures. Meanwhile, men kept freezing. Wind blast was the single largest cause of high-altitude frostbite, responsible for 39% of all cases. By 1944, that proportion had risen to nearly 55%. The physics were brutal and simple. Air moving at 200 miles per hour strips heat from the human body faster than any heating system can replace it. Even a perfectly functioning suit couldn't overcome that when a waste gunner was leaning into the slipstream, tracking an attacking fighter. Then there was the problem of jammed guns. A .50 caliber machine gun could jam at any moment during combat. When it did, the gunner had seconds to clear it. Training manuals said this could be done while wearing the heavy leather flight gloves issued to crews. The training manuals were wrong. The gloves were too bulky. A man wearing them could grip a gun handle and press a trigger, but he couldn't work the fine mechanisms needed to clear a malfunction. Gunners discovered this in combat, when fighters were attacking and seconds mattered. They did what they had to do. They pulled off their gloves. They gripped frozen metal with bare fingers. They cleared the jams, and they lost fingers. Flesh froze on contact with metal chilled to 60 below 0. 15 seconds was enough for permanent damage. 30 seconds could mean amputation. Casualty reports noted these men had violated procedure by removing their gloves. The bureaucracy blamed them, but everyone who'd actually flown combat knew the truth. The choice was between losing fingers and losing your aircraft. The men did what they had to do because the alternative was dying. Master Sergeant Earl Southwick was a crew chief with the 398th Bomb Group. His job was keeping his assigned B-17 flying no matter what condition it returned in. He patched battle damage with sheet metal and rivets, replaced shot-out engines, fixed hydraulic lines and electrical systems and oxygen regulators and 1,000 other components that could fail under combat stress. He understood the difference between official specifications and operational reality. Specifications said certain repairs required depot-level maintenance, meaning the aircraft had to be taken out of service for weeks. Specifications said certain modifications needed engineering approval, meaning paperwork that would disappear into bureaucratic black holes. But the 8th Air Force needed every bomber it could put in the air. There was no time for proper channels. Southwick's assistant later wrote about those days. Had this kind of repair been made stateside, I could have been court-martialed, but this was a different time and place. We had to do what had to be done. The three-man ground crew maintained their B-17 so well that not one of their aircraft ever turned back from a mission because of mechanical problems. Southwick received the Bronze Star for this achievement. Ground crews throughout the theater improvised constantly. They fabricated unavailable parts. They performed repairs regulations said only depot facilities could attempt. They modified aircraft to solve problems the original designers never anticipated. But field expedients couldn't overcome systemic failure. The heating suits were designed wrong. The waste gun windows were open to the slipstream. Individual initiative couldn't fix that. The 8th Air Force needed solutions from the top down, developed by engineers, implemented across the entire force. Colonel Grow worked on multiple fronts simultaneously. Better suits that wouldn't fail. Better training so crews understood the dangers. Modified aircraft designs that would reduce exposure. The heating suit problem was most urgent. Grow's investigation had identified the core flaw. Series wiring meant a single break killed the entire suit. The solution was obvious to anyone who understood basic electrical engineering. Wire the elements in parallel. In a parallel circuit, each heating element operates independently. If one wire breaks, current flows through the remaining paths. A man might lose heat to one part of his body, but not everywhere at once. Grow pushed the requirements through procurement. General Electric developed a new suit based on parallel wiring principles. The F-2, electrically heated, flying suit, was standardized in August 1943. Instead of a one-piece coverall, it consisted of 4 main pieces: heated jacket, heated trousers, unheated outer jacket, unheated outer trousers. The modular design meant crews could replace individual components if one failed. The heating elements used more flexible wiring that resisted breakage. And critically, the wiring was connected in parallel. The F-2 could maintain comfort at 30 below zero. Later variants added thermostats, allowing crews to control heat levels instead of running at full power constantly. The F-3, introduced in spring 1944, extended the comfort range to 60 below. But developing new suits was only part of the solution. Manufacturing took time. Distribution took more time. Training took still more time. While improved equipment worked through the supply chain, men continued freezing. The second major improvement addressed wind blast directly. The B-17 model began production in July 1943. The new variant featured enclosed waist gun windows, guns mounted through openings in plexiglass panels that blocked wind while allowing the weapons to traverse and track targets. The enclosed windows dramatically reduced frostbite among waist gunners. Men who'd been losing fingers to wind exposure could now operate their weapons in relative comfort. The cold was still present, but it was manageable. The kind that heated suits and insulated clothing could handle. Grow pushed for additional innovations beyond suits and windows. He designed flexible gloves that didn't have to be removed to clear jammed guns. Created fire-resistant face and neck protectors. Designed electrically heated blankets for wounded men whose suits had to be cut away for treatment. In July 1943, Grow received the Legion of Merit for developing body armor to protect combat crews. His analysis had shown nearly 70% of combat wounds came from low-velocity shrapnel that could be stopped by lightweight armor. In May 1944, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his comprehensive work on crew protection, heated clothing, wind protection, casualty equipment, protective face gear. The recognition came because the solutions were working. Frostbite cases had decreased. Flight efficiency had increased. Crews were surviving missions they would have lost to the cold just months earlier. The statistics told the story. In early 1943, cold injuries exceeded combat wounds as a cause of crew losses. By late 1943 and into 1944, the proportions had reversed. Hand injuries, which had accounted for more than half of all cold injuries through July 1943, declined sharply as better gloves and improved training reduced the need to handle frozen metal with bare skin. German intelligence noticed the changes. Luftwaffe pilots who'd grown accustomed to American formations suffering from cold-related problems began encountering a more effective enemy. Waist gunners who'd once been slow and clumsy were now tracking targets with full dexterity. All turret gunners who'd once been incapacitated were staying in the fight for entire missions. The Germans observed effects without knowing causes. American defensive fire seemed more accurate. Formations seemed more disciplined. Bombers stayed tight in the defensive box. Some improvement came from better fighter escort as P-51 Mustangs arrived. Some came from tactics learned through bloody experience. But some came from crews that were simply more effective because they weren't fighting frostbite while fighting the Luftwaffe. A gunner with functional hands could track a target smoothly. A gunner with numb fingers couldn't. A crew with all positions manned by alert, warm airmen could maintain proper defensive coverage. A crew with frostbite casualties couldn't. The difference was survival. Lieutenant John Luckadoo flew B-17s with the 100th Bomb Group, the unit that became known as the Bloody 100th because of its staggering casualty rate. The group suffered losses so severe that some crews believed the unit was cursed. Other bomber groups avoided flying near the 100th in formation, convinced their bad luck was contagious. The reality was simpler and more tragic. The 100th wasn't cursed. They were simply assigned to some of the most dangerous missions during the worst period of the air war. Deep penetration raids into Germany before long-range fighter escort was available. Heavily defended targets while the Luftwaffe was at peak strength. They paid the price for strategic decisions made far above their pay grade. Luckadoo completed his 25 required combat missions between June 1943 and February 1944. One of the few men in his unit to do so. He flew through the worst period of the air war over Europe, when statistically a man couldn't expect to survive his tour. Decades later, when Luckadoo was over 100 years old and the last surviving pilot from the original Bloody 100th, he spoke about those days to audiences who could barely imagine what he'd experienced. Crew members experienced fighting at an altitude of 25,000 feet, he said. They withstood temperatures of -40 degrees Fahrenheit and survived on oxygen above 10,000 feet due to unpressurized cabins. He recalled his own experience with the cold. My foot froze to a control pedal. I had to land with my heels. I couldn't even apply the brakes. Temperatures were -50 to 60 below zero. He described 4 challenges that defined every mission. Fighters. Flak. Frostbite. Fear. The alliteration captured everything. German defenders were only part of the danger. The environment itself was trying to kill them. The 8th Air Force flew from 40 bomber bases scattered across East Anglia. Initially, crews were required to complete 25 missions to rotate home. Airmen had approximately 1 in 3 odds of reaching that number during 1942 and 1943. 2 out of every 3 men would be killed, severely wounded, or captured before completing their tours. By war's end, the 8th Air Force had suffered over 40,000 casualties, more than 26,000 killed. The death toll exceeded that of the United States Marine Corps for the entire Pacific War. The frostbite epidemic was one component of that larger catastrophe, a preventable component. Men died and suffered permanent injuries because equipment failed, because training was inadequate, because no one had anticipated how badly the cold would affect operations. Training programs in the United States hadn't prepared crews for the reality of high-altitude combat in European winter. Men trained in Texas and Arizona, where temperatures rarely dropped below freezing. They practiced at altitudes where cold was uncomfortable, but not dangerous. Then they arrived in England and flew missions into skies where temperatures reached 50 and 60 degrees below zero. Where the equipment they'd trained on failed under conditions it was never designed for. Where everything they thought they knew proved inadequate. The training gap between what they learned stateside and what they needed to know in combat was filled by experience. And experience was paid for in blood and frozen flesh. The lessons learned in those frozen skies shaped military aviation for generations afterward. When the Boeing B-29 Superfortress entered service against Japan in 1944, it featured fully pressurized crew compartments. The crew didn't need electrically heated suits because the cabin maintained survivable temperatures at altitude. Gun turrets were remotely controlled from inside the pressurized cabin. The B-29 represented a fundamentally different approach to high-altitude combat. Instead of trying to protect humans against an inhospitable environment, it eliminated their exposure entirely. The crew flew in shirt-sleeve comfort, while their aircraft operated at altitudes that would freeze an unprotected man in minutes. This design philosophy persisted into the jet age and beyond. Modern military aircraft feature pressurized, climate-controlled cockpits. Fighter pilots wear flight suits designed primarily for G-force protection and emergency ejection, not for survival in Arctic temperatures. The hard lessons of 1943 and 1944 taught aircraft designers a fundamental truth. Human beings cannot reliably survive extreme cold, no matter how much protective equipment they wear. Better to engineer the cold out of the equation entirely. Every subsequent generation of military aircraft has followed this principle. Modern bombers and fighters maintain comfortable temperatures regardless of altitude or external conditions. Pilots face many dangers, but freezing to death is not among them. The 8th Air Force bought that safety with blood and frozen flesh over the skies of Germany. The engineering changes also reflected a broader shift in how the military thought about human factors in combat equipment. Before the frostbite crisis, designers often treated human limitations as problems for users to overcome through training and discipline. If the heating suit failed, train the crews to operate without it. If the gloves were too bulky, train the crews to work around them anyway. The frostbite epidemic demonstrated the bankruptcy of this approach. No amount of training could enable human fingers to function at 60 below zero. No amount of discipline could prevent flesh from freezing on contact with frozen metal. The human body had physical limits that couldn't be overcome through willpower. After the war, military equipment design increasingly incorporated human factors engineering from the start. Designers asked not just whether equipment would function, but whether humans could function while using it. Colonel Malcolm Grow continued his distinguished career after the war. When the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, the new Air Force Medical Service needed leadership from someone who understood both aviation and combat medicine. On July 1, 1949, Malcolm Grow became the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force. He retired on December 1, 1949, after more than 31 years in uniform. He'd served in 2 world wars, worn the uniforms of both Imperial Russia and the United States, pioneered the field of aviation medicine. He died on October 20, 1960, at age 72, at the Air Force Hospital at Andrews Air Force Base. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. 2 years later, the Malcolm Grow Medical Center at Joint Base Andrews was named in his honor, a permanent reminder of his contributions to military medicine. John Luckadoo, the last surviving pilot of the Bloody 100th, died on September 1, 2025, at age 103. He'd spent his final years telling the stories of the men who flew with him, making sure the world remembered what they endured. He served as technical consultant for the 2024 series Masters of the Air, ensuring that a new generation would understand what his generation faced. The men who froze in the skies over Germany are gone now. The waist gunners and ball turret operators who endured -50-degree cold for hours while fighting for their lives. The tail gunners and radio operators who suffered frostbite despite wearing every piece of protective gear the Army could provide. Their generation has passed into history. But the world they left behind was shaped by their suffering. Every pressurized cockpit, every climate-controlled cruise station, more. Every piece of cold weather protective equipment used by modern aviators. All of it traces back to the failures and solutions of 1943. The frostbite epidemic was a preventable tragedy that became a forcing function for innovation. Men suffered and died because equipment was inadequate. Their suffering drove development of equipment that was adequate. That's often how military technology advances. Not through abstract research in comfortable laboratories. Not through theoretical analysis by engineers who've never seen combat, but through urgent, desperate need to solve problems that are killing people right now. Today, this mission, this hour, the pressure of combat accelerates innovation in ways peacetime never can. Failure means death. Death motivates change. Change saves the next crew. The 8th Air Force lost more men to frostbite than to enemy fire in the early months of the bombing campaign. That statistic should have been impossible. It became possible because people designing equipment had never experienced what their equipment would face. By late 1944, the problem was largely solved. Better suits with parallel wiring, enclosed waist gun windows, improved gloves, and protective equipment. Systematic training on cold weather operations. The frostbite epidemic had been reduced from crisis to manageable challenge. But the price of that solution was paid by the men who flew before the solutions arrived. The crews of 1942 and 1943. The men who discovered through their own frozen fingers what worked and what didn't at 30,000 feet. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered. Not as a story of failure, but as a story of adaptation and learning under the worst possible conditions. They faced fighters. They faced flak. They faced frostbite. They faced fear. And somehow enough of them survived to teach the lessons that would save those who came after. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees and specifications and procurement processes, but through sergeants and surgeons who see problems, find solutions, and refuse to accept that good men must keep dying from preventable causes. Colonel Malcolm Gross saw the problem. He documented it. He analyzed it. He developed solutions. He pushed those solutions through a bureaucracy that moved too slowly while men were losing fingers and toes. He saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to the cold. His name is on a hospital now. But his real monument is every pressurized cockpit, every climate-controlled crew station, every piece of protective equipment that keeps modern aviators safe from the killing cold of high altitude. The men of the 8th Air Force bought that safety with their suffering. The waist gunners with frozen hands, the ball turret operators with dead heating suits, the tail gunners with frostbitten ears. They were test subjects in an experiment they never agreed to participate in. They discovered the limits of human endurance at minus 60 degrees. They paid the price so no one would have to pay it again. Long after the smoke cleared, the silence still speaks of what they built and what it cost.